Welcome to the Calm Analytics channel. This is Tizengauzen with you. Today is August 24th. There are a lot of important news items in this episode. Why did the US block ATACMS and Storm Shadow missile strikes on Russian territory? A new batch of missiles for Ukraine. More than 3,000 units are being sent to Ukraine. Ust-Luga is on fire. One of the largest ports was attacked by drones. And Putin has once again failed the test of his super missile and is convening a secret meeting of nuclear specialists. And Finnish President Alexander Stubb stated that Trump's patience is running out and things will soon get very tough for Putin. And also about how Ukraine actually has far more friends than we might think. All this and more in today's episode. If this is your first time on this channel, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And let's get started. First of all, today I would like to congratulate my fellow countrymen on Independence Day. Today is a special day for us Ukrainians. I congratulate all of you, dear Ukrainians, on the Independence Day of our country. Ukrainians have shown the whole world that no one has the right to impose their will on a free and independent nation. Many have given their lives for freedom and so that their children and grandchildren could live in a free country. A deep bow to those who defend Ukraine, and eternal glory to those who gave their lives for our independence. Happy Independence Day, dear Ukrainians. Glory to Ukraine. Yes. Well, let's move on to the news. The United States is committed to Ukraine's future as an independent state. We believe in a coordinated settlement that will preserve Ukraine's sovereignty and guarantee long-term security, leading to a lasting peace. This is how U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio congratulated Ukrainians on the 34th anniversary of independence. For me, there are a few people right now in the Trump administration, in the leadership of the United States, in his team, who I really find appealing, and Marco Rubio is one of them. I was recently pleasantly surprised when he rather sharply explained that all these folders with strings, all this mothballs, all this Soviet stuff, and Politburo that Putin is putting on with his made-up history. These folders with the Polovtsians, with the Pechenegs that Putin drags around with him and tries to shove on everyone. So Marco Rubio explained that the US is not really interested in this Putin story, or rather not interested at all. And Marco Rubio couldn't have been unaware that Putin's made-up and decontextualized, encapsulated history is one of his main fetishes. It is precisely through the lens of this kind of hybrid history that Putin tries to explain that Ukraine is a fictitious state, that Russia is somehow being infringed upon in its interests, that Russia has the right to dictate in the region who should go where and how, based on some former phantom achievements, specifically those of the Soviet Union. So this whole mess, Lenin, Stalin invented Ukraine, the Empire, Alexander, Catherine, Peter, Putin, and so on. This mess in Putin's aging, balding head has really fermented, and he tries to infect, to bite others with this made-up history, anyone he sees. But Rubio just went and devalued this, Putin's precious. It's his precious, after all. He pores over those maps they bring him. There's no Ukraine here, look, but here it is. Throw out this map, burn that one. And this one, put it in my folder. That's how it goes. Like the Tsar Kashchi wasting away over his gold, but here it's over a map. That's exactly about Putin. And at the same time, when Marco Rubio said that we're not really interested in this whole folder story, he understood perfectly well that there's probably a pretty strict recommendation not to irritate Putin, not to call him offensive names like Baldosaurus, for example, or Old Man Kabayev. Well, we can afford not to make any harsh statements. And let me remind you, Marco Rubio is the head of the State Department, the head of the Foreign Policy Agency, the equivalent of the Foreign Ministry. So this kind of statement is most likely his personal position. He just couldn't hold back anymore. It feels like he's just doing his job and really stands not exactly on a pro-Ukrainian, but on a fair position. Not anti-Russian, not pro-Ukrainian, but a fair position. But he doesn't make it public. Because if you make it public now, you immediately become a target for the Russians to take you down. It's like in a jury trial, both sides have the right to challenge jurors. Like, okay, this one will most likely vote for or against, either for the prosecution or on the contrary for acquittal. So we dismiss him. It's pretty much the same situation here. Russia is actively eliminating everyone who is openly pro-Ukrainian. This spring, the Russians managed to take down Keith Kellogg. Of course, he came back later. And by the way, special thanks not only to Marco Rubio. Who else makes a good impression? Keith Kellogg, of course. Special thanks to his daughter Megan, who helps Ukraine and leads a foundation that has been providing humanitarian support to dozens of organizations in Ukraine from the very beginning. And Megan probably played one of the absolutely key and pivotal roles in Keith Kellogg taking a much more aggressive and determined stance, and she ultimately succeeded in that endeavor. I remembered the words she wrote to her father while she was in Kyiv during a massive shelling of the city. Megan wrote, "It's a very loud night in Kyiv, Dad. And it seems to me that Russia doesn't want any ceasefire." So that's what it's about, and of course they have a pretty close relationship. And I saw the photos, with the grandchildren. Well, Keith Kellogg is quite a guy, a really cool guy, a general. All in all, Ukraine has a lot more friends than we think. And of course, just recently, the group of those who really influence the agenda, which is shifting from let's not provoke Putin to, excuse my French, let's give him a real kick in the ass, a proper tough one, has grown. And now Melania Trump is among them too. Indeed, she also played one of the key roles in turning this agenda away from that nasty, repulsive, Botox-filled face. So when she wrote that letter in Alaska, well, first she would bring Donald Trump back down to earth. He would come home all happy. "I had a great talk with Putin." Well, okay, not home, just from one room to another. "I had a great conversation. I'm so amazing. The breeze is ruffling my golden locks. My tan looks perfect. I had an awesome chat with Putin." And Melania says to him, come over here for a second, and shows him how Putin has just bombed yet another Ukrainian city. And Trump himself admitted it, saying, "Yes, Melania influenced me." And the letter in Alaska, that's very important. Melania Trump wrote a letter to Putin, and it was delivered to him. I think Putin even read it out loud afterward. Well, she didn't write it in the style of, "How dare you, you scum, stealing children." Of course not. She wrote, "Let's give happiness to the children. Let's make sure, well, the children are not to blame. It's the war," and so on. So even if, well, in general, she wrote it beautifully. But you and I both understand that Putin, who has a warrant out for him for stealing and illegally deporting Ukrainian children, when he receives a letter saying, "Let's give happiness back to the children," he knows perfectly well what that letter is about. And for the whole world, for the entire world, it once again highlights what Putin is doing. That's why today there are still many friends, many people with a pro-Ukrainian stance, not only in the US, but all over the world, not just in Trump's circle. And that's right, I started with the words my acquaintance from the United States said, and I remember them very well. By the way, he worked not just with one president of the United States. He said that you have far more friends than you think. Well, let's hope so. But our main hope lies with the armed forces of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, who have truly shown the whole world that independence is something worth fighting for, no matter what. That's why today, as always, I want to sincerely thank everyone who is helping Ukraine fight for freedom and independence against this utterly inhuman monster, for whom it seems to me life itself is something repulsive. I simply have no other explanation for why he wants to destroy his own people, why he wants to ruin other free nations. Maybe he made some kind of pact with the devil, I don't know, that he needs to destroy 1 million Russians, maybe 2, and then he'll get a couple more years of life. I hope the count will only go down and that he won't live long. As always, we're sending this message out into the cosmos. Well, that's the end of our philosophical digression. Let's move on to our news. Under Trump, strikes on Russia with ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles were quietly blocked, according to the Wall Street Journal. So they write that as soon as Trump came to power, an unofficial procedure was introduced requiring approval for any strikes by Ukraine on Russian territory. This approval had to come from the highest level, specifically from Defense Secretary Pete Haxton, but overall this led to the cessation of ATACMS and Storm Shadow strikes. Officially, neither side has commented on this, but in fact, since this spring, and really since Donald Trump came to power, there hasn't been a single ATACMS or Storm Shadow strike on Russian territory. At least none that have been confirmed. So what exactly did this approval entail? That permission to carry out a strike with either Storm Shadow or ATACMS could only be granted personally by the U.S. Secretary of Defense. And by the way, this was confirmed by 2 American sources and 1 British source. Why Storm Shadow as well? Because the targeting information comes from the Americans. And the architect of this procedure was none other than Deputy Secretary of Defense Elbridge Colby. By the way, he's known for the fact that for him, the only real confrontation is with China. Everything else can be sacrificed, the US military commitments in other regions can be given up, but China, I just don't understand why the interests of the United States can't be considered in both cases. By the way, I would take a very close look at Elbridge Colby himself or at his relatives and close associates. Why is he making such decisions? By the way, it was his idea, without any justification, to suspend aid to Ukraine this spring. Yes, I understand that this couldn't have happened without Donald Trump's approval, but Mr. Colby, the very active deputy minister, is working hard in this direction. And let me remind you that Donald Trump wrote on social media this week that it's impossible to win a war by sticking only to defensive actions. That's true? Well, so what? Indeed, it's impossible to win, especially when Ukraine has far fewer resources and less weaponry. Over there, the entire club of dictators is huffing and puffing to help the Russians, supplying them with firewood, weapons, drones, missiles, components. Even North Korea is sending troops. And here, even Trump is saying, well, it's impossible to win, so let's do something to make it possible. After all, it's all within your power. This procedure has been in effect since the end of spring. But let me remind you that in November 2024, Ukraine used ATACMS for the first time against Russian military targets. At that time, the strike was carried out specifically on Russian territory. That is, at first, permission was granted. By various estimates, between 300 and 500 ATACMS were transferred to Ukraine under Biden. And initially, permission was given to strike only the occupied territories. That is, places like Donbass and Crimea. At that time, they thoroughly bombed the Crimean airfields, taking out air defense systems there. I remember that the Russians moved their aircraft closer to the bridge, to the Kerch area, and some of them were relocated to Russia. And then, in November 2024, the ATACMS missile was used for the first time against Russian territory. An arsenal was attacked, the 67th arsenal of the main missile and artillery directorate of the Russian Ministry of Defense. And after that, there was a series of attacks on arsenals. Wonderful. You probably remember how the arsenals detonated. Hundreds of thousands of tons of ammunition exploded, regardless of whether the arsenal had been modernized under the program or not, whether it was a bunker or not. In short, things were blowing up, debris was flying for dozens of kilometers, villages had to be evacuated. All in all, they did a very good job. Then it all stopped. And when permission was given to strike Russian territory, Ukraine, according to various estimates, had about 50 ATACMS left. So, if at the beginning, when there were 500, they had struck Russian territory, there wouldn't have been a single arsenal left. By the way, the strikes on Russian arsenals had no effect on the United States. Those who say that the United States will become a party to the conflict, well, they hit the 67th arsenal with ATACMS, for example. What happened? What changed? Nothing at all. Let's put it mildly, yes. And then there's the Trump administration. Here's another piece of news, by the way. It might seem a bit contrasting to you, but we'll get to the bottom of it in a moment. The Trump administration approved the sale to Ukraine of 3,350 extended-range missiles and rams, which are expected to be delivered to the armed forces within 6 weeks. The same Wall Street Journal reports this, citing its sources. So these missiles have a range of 150 to 280 miles, which is 240 to 450 kilometers. That's a very considerable distance if you're targeting Russian territory. The total package is worth 850 million. Well, overall, it's good news, really good news. Honestly, I think it's fantastic news. These are air-to-ground missiles, meaning they're launched from aircraft. And here it's important to understand that every use of these missiles, including these, will also need to be coordinated with the Pentagon. So, in fact, Trump is getting another important tool to put pressure on Putin. But not a single missile will be launched without the approval of Pete Hegseth. And right next to him, Elbridge Colby. So in effect, Trump is hanging these guillotines over Putin and saying, at any moment I can cut this string, I can impose this sanction. So right now, Trump has two rather effective tools at his disposal. He can immediately impose sanctions against those who buy Russian energy resources. And he can give the green light to the Pentagon, let's say, to launch new missiles for 450 kilometers into Russian Federation territory. But I guarantee you that hundreds of missiles won't be launched all at once. So I think you understand that perfectly well. Most likely it will be the same as with the sanctions. They imposed a 25% tariff against India. Did Putin agree? No? Well, let's keep watching. It will be the same here. Let's launch 3 or 4 missiles. Did Putin agree? No? Well, let's keep watching. I do not rule out that if Putin turns out to be completely intractable, then a couple dozen missiles will fly at Russian arsenals, perhaps at some headquarters. But most likely they will start, or rather continue with, arsenals. But a strike with hundreds of missiles all at once on all the arsenals within range, on fuel depots, logistics hubs, that would immediately bring Putin to his senses. There's no need to act with half measures. Hit, and hit again. By the way, today I looked at the monitoring of Russian analytical centers. That's pretty much how they assess this initiative. Once again, they want to scare us, but in reality, it will amount to nothing. They won't dare, they can't, they won't want to. Putin will always sort everything out, immediately make a call, and so on and so forth. Although it did make them a bit more anxious. Friends, let me remind you that right now our front is being held by our defenders. I want to ask you to join an important fundraiser for our military medics. The 1st MedBat, the medical battalion, we are raising funds for them for a mall. We've been collecting for a little over a week now. I think we'll reach our goal soon. The mall is a ground-based drone that allows us to evacuate our wounded defenders without putting people at risk. So it's essentially a ground drone, an all-terrain vehicle with airless tires and an armored capsule where the soldier is secured and it transports them to a safe distance. After that, medics take over and save his life. So this is an investment, a direct investment in saving the lives not only of our defenders, not only our heroes, but also our medics. This means they physically won't have to go out under shrapnel and shelling to retrieve a soldier, because unfortunately it often happens that those who carry out evacuations end up wounded themselves or sadly even lose their lives. That's why I sincerely ask you to support this important unmanned evacuation drone.
Evacuating the wounded is one of the most difficult challenges on the front lines today. Together with Boris Tizengauzen's channel, the 1st Separate Medical Battalion is raising funds for ground-based unmanned systems for evacuating the wounded, called MAL. Your 100 hryvnias can save a life. Thank you all for your support.
The link to donate is in the description of this video and also in the comments. There's Mono, there's Private, and there's PayPal for those who want to help from abroad. I always sincerely thank you on my own behalf, and in this case, also on behalf of our medics. Well, what else is there to say? There's nothing more to add, so I ask you, friends, to support this fundraiser. And if you're watching not on my channel, which happens sometimes, there will be a QR code right here, and you can use it to go directly to the fundraiser. I ask you, let's help our medics. You all are just awesome. No matter how many times we've helped our soldiers, they're always grateful. But you really are just the best. We're doing a good thing together, believe me. This is news that truly deserves attention. At last, one of the largest ports in the Russian Federation, Ust-Luga, has been attacked. Last night, drones, then their debris, and then fragments of that debris reached the Novatek terminal in the largest port on the Baltic Sea. This just goes to show that Putin can be quickly kicked into sitting down at the negotiating table. In other words, if the US had actually given the green light to strike 2 key ports, Novorossiysk and Ust-Luga, Russia would have faced a real collapse within a few months. And by the way, this is despite the fact that the Russians regularly strike the port of Odessa. So at the Ust-Luga port, at the Novatek terminal, which, let me remind you, is involved in the extraction and processing of natural gas, a fire broke out, and a very serious one, after drone debris fell there. The governor has already confirmed it because at this point it's everywhere. It's hit all the news channels. This Ust-Luga is the largest port on the Baltic, the second largest by volume after Novorossiysk. So that's excellent. This is wonderful news. 2 ports and an oil refinery. That's what basically renders Putin toothless. In all his decades in power, he hasn't managed to move Russia from being a raw materials state to any other status. Just selling oil, gas, and whatever else. Everything that can be sold, timber, minerals, and so on. By the way, Putin convened a secret meeting with nuclear specialists after the attempt to launch the newest Burevestnik missile. In one of my previous episodes, I talked in detail about this newest missile, which, let me remind you, is called the Flying Chernobyl. That is, it has a nuclear and atomic power unit instead of a regular engine. And well, Putin once claimed that this missile can fly indefinitely, since it runs on a nuclear reactor. At best, it can fly for about 2 minutes, because none of the 13 tests lasted longer than 2 minutes. Moreover, when it lasted 2 minutes, it fell into the Barents Sea, the power unit exploded, and from there, where Putin arrived, in Sarov, the center of Russia's nuclear industry, from that very Sarov, 7 scientists, as they say, were blown to pieces. And Putin came, and so look at what he had in mind. There, another Kommersant journalist popped up, one who does controlled leaks on purpose. And this journalist, whose last name is Kolesnikov, said that the meeting with the nuclear scientists was about testing the missile, and they discussed whether it would be possible to put the Burevestnik into service as early as this year. Let me remind you, Putin announced the creation of this missile 7 years ago. So, not a single successful test out of 13 has been achieved with this missile. They were supposed to test this missile recently. No one, an American, well, a radio, an aircraft that monitors all sorts of radiation emissions was sent there. No one noticed anything. Apparently, it not only didn't even come out of the silo, it just, nothing happened at all. And after the 14th test went the same way, the scientists packed up their things and returned to Sarov. And then Putin came to them and said, "So, can we put it into mass production? Can we put the Burevestnik into service?" But you'd have to be a clinical, probably, idiot, right, to want to put it into service after all those failed tests, especially since there were 2 really disastrous ones. One time, the missile exploded right in the silo, and Rosatom employees died there as well. And the second time was when they were retrieving the power unit from the Barents Sea. And then Putin showed up. So this is a classic case of a controlled leak. So this journalist says, Putin held a meeting there, asking if it's possible to put it into service this year. He knows perfectly well that it's not possible. He knows it very well. But this is the kind of leak, and everyone's like, oh no, oh no. Now Putin is going to deploy the Burevestnik. I've said 100 times that Russian nuclear weapons, if they even exist, of course, and who knows what condition all these Burevestniks, Bulavas, and some Poseidons are in, most likely they'll end up destroying exactly those people or the very site from which they're launched. The submarine Kursk is a good example of that. I don't know how that meeting actually went. If 7 people from Sarov in 2019 were simply obliterated. So, how did that meeting go? Well, comrade scientists, who's ready to go to the tests this time? Let's make 2 groups, so to speak. One as a backup, right? If one group gets vaporized into atoms again, the second can at least collect something from what's left of them. So how are things with the scientists there in Sarov? Basically, it's all just a show of threats, a simulation of frantic activity. Now it's Mosfilm again under new management, or rather, Soyuz Multfilm, now led by Mikhalkov. They're making cartoons over there, like a rocket flying around 10 galaxies. In short, it's business as usual. It's sad, of course, that an old, life-hating, senile man is now trying to control the president of the #1 country. And in some ways, he's even succeeding. Instead of, well, the best weapon against a moth is a fly swatter or a slipper. Instead of just squashing this Kabayev with a slipper, they decided to negotiate with him. Well, we'll see. So, well, what else has happened here? Instead of talking about peace, well, Putin doesn't like to talk about peace. Instead, his various minions pretend to be having peace talks on his behalf. Meanwhile, a Russian combat drone manufacturer is rounding up young women in South Africa under the cover of BRICS, sending them to that very same alabuga. In other words, they're luring cheap labor there on an industrial scale, promising them they'll study at a university, work in the hotel or hospitality business or somewhere else, and then bringing them to Alabuga. And now everyone, hand over your passports and start assembling drones. That's it. As a result, this year we're already talking about hiring more than 8,000 female workers, mostly from African countries. Just so you understand, Putin has no intention of stopping. And it's all well and good to talk to him, be friends, give him 2 or 3 weeks. That gives him the opportunity to get more weapons, to hire 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 people to assemble drones. Just imagine that. That's why he needs to be, well, spread thin. Even though the Russian economy is seriously ailing, Putin is still being given more time to carry out his evil deeds. At the same time, Trump is saying that, well, this war needs to be stopped. Those are his own words. 7,000 people a week shouldn't be dying. Imagine if in all the media there was a proper clarification in parentheses of what Donald Trump is actually saying, translated into the real number of victims. For example, look, Donald Trump said that in 2 weeks he will figure out how he will deal with Putin. In parentheses, when 14,000 more people die, he will make that decision. That would make things a bit clearer, wouldn't it? Or Donald Trump gave Putin 50 days to cease fire, an ultimatum. Remember that one? So in effect, he sanctioned the killing of another 50,000 people. It sounds completely different, doesn't it? So when Trump says, I need 2 weeks, that's 14,000 lives. I understand that Trump doesn't care, but it sounds completely different. And I came across an absolutely brilliant interview just to understand that Ukraine really has more friends than we think. Of course, Finland's president Alexander Stubb, he made his position clear from the start. Finland borders Russia. Finland went through this bitter experience in the Winter War, lost territories. The Soviet Union also attacked. There were a lot of similarities there. And it was as if Finland was about to attack the USSR and then lost part of its territories but managed to preserve its sovereignty and statehood. We all remember this. So the president of Finland said some very sensible things in an interview with one of the Finnish publications. I just want to cite this as perhaps a model of diplomacy here and now, especially diplomacy that takes into account the particularities of Donald Trump. President Stubb stated in the interview that Putin made the most